Mrs. Sarah is an elderly woman living in New York City. On this particular day, she has ordered an Uber to take her on a trip down memory lane. She is a woman full of life and stories to tell, and she is on a journey to visit an old house, a place where she used to live with her husband, who has since passed away. As she settles into the back seat of the Uber, Mrs. Sarah decides to share her story with the driver, Jack. She believes that it is important to pass on her experiences and memories to others. And what better way to do so than to share it with someone who is willing to listen? Mrs. Sarah is excited to relive her past and share her interesting and wonderful life story with Jack as they make their way to her old house. As they drive towards her old house, Mrs. Sarah begins to share the story of her early years with Jack, the Uber driver. "I grew up in a small town, surrounded by a loving family," Mrs. Sarah says, her voice filled with fond memories. "I had a wonderful childhood, filled with laughter and adventure. I was always interested in learning and growing. So I worked hard in school and eventually went on to pursue a career that I was passionate about," she continues. "I was fortunate to find success and fulfillment in my chosen profession. But the most exciting event of Mrs. Sarah's life was when she met her husband." And she begins to tell the story with a twinkle in her eye. "We met at a local park on a beautiful summer day," she begins. "I was there for a picnic with my friends, and he was there for a game of baseball with his buddies. It was a chance encounter that changed my life forever," Mrs. Sarah says, a hint of drama in her voice. "Our paths crossed, and before I knew it, we were engaged in a deep conversation that lasted for hours. He was such a charmer, always making me laugh, and I was immediately drawn to him. I knew from that moment that he was the one for me. We fell deeply in love and embarked on a journey of building a life together," she continues, a smile spreading across her face. "Those were the best years of my life, filled with laughter and joy. My husband was my soulmate, and I will always cherish those memories." As they continue their drive, Mrs. Sarah begins to share the story of her marriage life with Jack. "We got married soon after we met, and it was the happiest day of my life," she says, her voice filled with a sense of nostalgia. "We were so in love, and nothing could stand in our way. Our early years of marriage were filled with so much love, laughter, and adventure," Mrs. Sarah continues, a smile spreading across her face. "We traveled the world, experiencing new cultures and creating memories that would last a lifetime. One of our favorite trips was to Paris, where we strolled the city hand in hand, enjoying croissants and coffee at a quaint sidewalk cafe. But the true joy of our marriage was the love and comfort we found in each other. She adds, no matter what life threw our way, we always had each other. We were each other's rock, and our love only grew stronger with each passing day. I remember one time when my husband was going through a difficult time at work. Mrs. Sarah begins, a smile spreading across her face as she recalls a fond memory. He came home stressed and overwhelmed, but I was there for him, making him a cup of tea and listening to his troubles. By the end of the night, he was smiling and laughing again, and I was so grateful that I could be there for him in that moment. My husband was my best friend, my partner, my everything. Mrs. Sarah says, her voice breaking a little. We built a life together that was filled with happiness, and I will always be grateful for the years we had together. The mood in the car shifts as Mrs. Sarah begins to talk about life after her husband's passing. It was a difficult time for me, losing the love of my life, she says, her voice filled with sadness. A single tear rolls down her cheek as she speaks. Driver David notices Mrs. Sarah's distress and reaches out to comfort her. I'm so sorry for your loss, he says, offering her a tissue from the glove compartment. At first, I just went through the motions, she continues, wiping away the tear. I would wake up in the morning, go about my day, and then go to bed at night. But it all felt so empty, like a part of me was missing. I eventually found solace in volunteering at the local hospital, where I could spend my days helping others and keeping busy. Mrs. Sarah says, a small smile appearing on her face as she recalls a brighter moment in her life. It gave me a sense of purpose and helped me to heal in my own way. But even now, all these years later, there are still moments when I feel so alone, she adds, her voice quiet and filled with emotion. I miss my husband every day, and I know I always will. David nods understandingly, offering a gentle smile of comfort. Mrs. Sarah pauses for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. But I also know that I am so grateful for the years we had together and for the love that will always be a part of me. And I am grateful for the memories that bring a smile to my face and a warmth to my heart, even on the saddest of days. As the car pulls up to the old house, Mrs. Sarah's eyes light up with joy and a hint of nostalgia. We're here, she says, looking out the window with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Driver David parks the car and turns to Mrs. Sarah. Is there anything you need help with? He asks. noticing the look of wonder in her eyes. "No, I can manage. Thank you for being such a kind and patient driver," Mrs. Sarah says, reaching for her purse. She opens the door and steps out of the car, taking a moment to look around. The house, surrounded by a white picket fence and surrounded by a lush garden, has a warm and inviting feeling. Mrs. Sarah takes a deep breath and walks towards the front gate, her hand resting on the gate post as she looks up at the house. "This was my home," she says, her voice filled with emotion. "This is where I lived with my husband and where we raised our children. It's been so long since I've been back here. I'm not sure what to expect." Driver David nods, understanding the significance of the moment for Mrs. Sarah. He watches as she takes a step forward, the memories of her life here flooding back. The house has aged, just like Mrs. Sarah, but it still holds the same charm and character it had all those years ago. "It's just as I remembered it," Mrs. Sarah says, her voice filled with wonder. "The garden is still as beautiful as ever. I used to spend hours tending to the flowers and shrubs, listening to the birds singing in the trees." Driver David smiles, imagining the younger Mrs. Sarah tending to her garden, surrounded by the beauty of nature. He watches as she makes her way up the steps, unlocking the front door and stepping inside. The house has been well kept, but the interior shows signs of neglect and disuse. Mrs. Sarah wanders from room to room, taking in the sights and sounds of her old home. Memories come flooding back as she stands in the kitchen where she cooked countless meals for her family, or in the living room where she and her husband spent countless evenings in front of the fire. "It's like time has stood still," she says, her voice filled with emotion. "I can still feel my husband's presence here, and it brings me such comfort." Driver David watches from the doorway, giving Mrs. Sarah the space she needs to revisit her past. He can see the joy in her eyes and the smile on her face, and it brings him a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he was able to play a small role in such a special moment for her. "Thank you for the ride and for listening to my story," Mrs. Sarah says, turning to David with a warm smile. "I will never forget this day." Driver David returns the smile, happy to have been a part of such a special moment. He watches as Mrs. Sarah continues to explore her old home, ready to revisit the memories of her past.